for who's watching here from Europe. Good morning, good afternoon. On the other side of the ocean, good night. It's a pleasure to be back here September after the vacations here, August in Italy. It's a pretty hot period, moment of leave, moment of relax, but we never stop really here in Ethics for Growth. So we are here with a new and young guest that is probably a well-known face for some of you that read our articles, our posts on the page, since she's a contributor to our dissemination project, and it's a pleasure to host her and to host her ideas in Ethics for Growth. She's Valentina Chabert, and she is graduated in international relations from the Foscari University of Venice. Then she, like me, I was from Rome, but still starting from international relations. And then she moved to environmental responsibility of multinational corporations applied to international law, with a focus on intergovernmental and bottom-up approaches to corporate social responsibility. So it's a pretty hot topic. She's the chief editor of the environmental energy section of the International Affairs Review Opinio Juris, Law and Politics Review, and she contributes also to the legal review Diritto Consenso. In the end, last but not least, she works as a freelance journalist for a series of global affairs journals and research centers, including the European Youth Think Tank in Strasbourg. So a lot here on the plate. She also works, of course, as an international business consultant for an Italian energy consulting company in the field of energy. So today, she's with us with her skills, with her know-how. You can read down here. She's going to talk about well-being and sustainability. So I leave the floor to Valentina. Thank you very much. As usual, the format is the same. Brief introduction by Valentina, then conversation and questions from the audience with our expert ready to ask here live. Thank you very much. Welcome, Valentina.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having invited me to this really important discussion today. Before entering to the core of the conversation, I am very much honored to have the opportunity to present some aspects of corporate social responsibility with respect to the ordinary activities of fundamental economic actors as multinational enterprises, and also with a focus on international law and intergovernmental initiatives. Therefore, let me thank you once again, Claudio and Giuseppe, for the invitation. And since they already largely, I will now begin with my approximately 15 minutes presentation. As anticipated, my intervention today will concern the issue of the so-called corporate social responsibility from the point of view of multinational corporations, as well as the socio-economic and legal implications of the missed respect of social and environmental imperatives from private enterprises. And even though reaching my purpose, of course, would require much more time than the one I dispose of, I will do my best to provide you with all the most relevant, let's say, ingredients to orient in this complicated, though fascinating topic. I will then divide my speech in three main points. First, I will make a brief introduction on multinational corporations from the economic point of view, and I will explain you why I chose to concentrate my efforts on these precise economic actors during my research, specifically taking into account the legal aspects, which would then represent a problem and a difficulty for regulation. Secondly, I will present you some solutions with different degrees of binding force, which have been elaborated at different levels from the international community. There are mainly soft law initiatives and general codes drafted at intergovernmental and regional levels, as well as within the main international organizations. Last but not the least, the greatest part of my intervention today will concern the link between corporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability directly at the firm level, which mainly regards the initiatives taken within multinational enterprises and by the trade associations to which they belong. So let's start with the first point. Why focusing the attention on multinational corporations? Well, according to the most recent World Investment reports, for the time being, there exist more than 80,000 multinational corporations, and the 80% of the world's major corporations are incorporated under the domestic law of the so-called traditional triad, which encompasses North America, Western Europe, and Japan. So since the 1990s, the well-known phenomenon of globalization exacerbated the trend of the race to the bottom to attract foreign investments and the embracing of the free market ideology supported by international financial institutions as the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, contributed to the elimination of obstacles to capital movements and international trade, thereby incentivizing the unrivaled powers MNCs have in present times, which can be easily compared to the one of states. Indeed, data evidence support the fact that the revenues of the largest multinational companies surpassed the GDP of a considerable number of states, though it is not a mystery that MNCs are fundamental actors nowadays. But with respect to our topic, it is also relevant to remark that MNCs can play a critical role in a sustainable managed world or serve as major impediments to this transition. This is to say that MNEs usually possess both the financial and the technological means, allowing for an active engagement in environmentally sound production processes and conducts. But on the other hand, when thinking of the possibility of regulating these actors, some legal problems emerge. So from the point of view of international law, the necessity of regulation has been debated by the international community for more than 40 years. However, a binding framework has not yet emerged, and therefore no obligation to protect the environment and social rights is imposed upon corporations. And this is also due to structural obstacles inherent to multinational organizational arrangements and the limitations of international law in terms of corporate personality. So the dualism between economic unity and legal plurality is considered to be at the basis of the absence of a shared regulatory law governing the activities of MNCs. In fact, even though a single economic plan exists, this is implemented by a group of foreign incorporated subsidiaries through the phenomenon of outsourcing, especially in less developed countries. And this is for what concerns the first point. Getting to the second point, only multi-stakeholders and initiatives aimed at transparent and participatory attitude of MNEs exist. And these include mainly non-binding codes of conduct and soft law instruments. I am normally used to distinguish such initiatives in CSR from above and CSR from below. Let's begin with the first. When referring to CSR from above, I include in my analysis all those initiatives developed at intergovernmental and regional level, such as the UN Global Compact, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, but also the performance standards of the World Bank International Finance Corporation. Sadly, we do not have the time to deepen all of them, but to quickly get into the point, it is remarkable that even though these codes of conduct, which in theory have to guide and inspire the conduct of the business world in the respect of sustainability, the environment, worker rights, human rights, these are to be considered weak, since they are mere soft law instruments and do not impose binding obligations upon corporations. So despite merely providing general standards of behavior to be followed by private entities, please do not believe that these codes of conduct are useless. In fact, they perform an unprecedented instructive function for businesses, which usually refer to this kind of CSR initiatives as benchmarks on which to develop their own self-regulation codes, and we will see it in a moment. So here I get to my third and last point. Before, I mentioned the CSR from below as a second perspective from which scholars observe the CSR phenomenon from the legal point of view. This expression makes reference to those codes of conduct elaborated directly by the private company itself, as well as by the trade associations to which it belongs, which is then able to impose the respect of such principles to all the corporations being part of the same trade association. But what is corporate social responsibility? We mentioned it multiple times today, but we have not given a definition yet, so I think that the moment has come. Overall, in spite of the lack of a common set of indicators and a widely accepted definition, the label of corporate social responsibility refers to the concept of voluntarily integrating social and environmental considerations, both in corporate operations, but also in the relation with stakeholders. And it is to say that the persistence of a regulatory void in the supervision of MNC's social and environmental conduct laid the basis for an enhanced attention on private self-regulation initiatives and consequently led to the proliferation of voluntary codes of conduct as a result of a growing hesitation of governments to introduce more stringent legislation on foreign companies. However, if we center for a moment on the nature of the CSR doctrine, different approaches exist. On the one hand, part of the debate concentrates on the unrealistic nature of the possibility that businesses will abandon consistent shares of profit on a voluntary basis just for the sake of human rights and environmental consideration. So, in fact, according to this line, the higher costs stemming from MNC's voluntary commitments would represent a loss for the company. On the other hand, the scholarly component inspired by economist Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics conceived the CSR discourse on mere economic terms. So according to this line, corporate voluntary commitments in the social and environmental sphere are intended to be fundamentally profit maximizers. And Friedman itself stresses the concept in an article published in the New York Times in 1970. And in particular, he said that there is only one social responsibility of businesses, which is to use its resources and to engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. But not only the definition of and the different line of thought represent a matter of discussion with respect to CSR, because the fact that the CSR doctrine entirely relies on voluntary adherence and the non-binding nature of codes of conduct prevent their qualification as traditional hard law, this raises concerns on its legitimacy. And in addition, the lack of an homogeneous transnational framework uniformly regulating corporate environmental conduct has to be considered, as well as the fact that an authority imposing sanctions in case of infringement is missing. Let's concentrate for a moment on individual CSR initiatives directly elaborated from firms in order to express their commitment to social, labor, and environmental standards. In this case, most of the major corporations periodically publish reports in which data concerning their social and environmental performance are presented. And this has developed since the 1990s, which corresponds to the moment when companies needed to appease the accusations arising from numerous social and environmental scandals in which they became involved. And also some codes of individual CSR initiatives recall the previously examined inter-governmental codes. And here we can clearly see what I have told you before. So the fact that the UN Global Compact, the OECD guidelines are likely to contribute to the enhancement of the value and the acceptance of such instruments in spite of their non-binding nature. When considering the downsides, I usually present the example of ExxonMobil. As you probably know, ExxonMobil is amongst the major global corporate enterprises in the field of energy provision and chemical manufacturing. And if we have a look at the website in which the individual code is publicly available, we see that the group is committed to grant high-quality products while taking into consideration sustainability concerns. And especially in the field of environmental impact mitigation. Nonetheless, in 2018, the company was involved in a scandal for having allegedly misled investors by voluntarily hiding the real cost of climate change mitigation measures within its business plan. And according to the state of New York, such behavior resulted in a $1.6 billion fraud. But notwithstanding, in 2019, a New York State court ruled in favor of ExxonMobil, finding that the erroneous disclosures of the enterprise did not result in a misleading effect on the investor decision. So on the one side, the adoption of corporate codes of conduct for the protection of the environment may enhance business behavior while performing their operations in areas of the world, especially developing host countries, in which environmental regulations are usually loose or poorly enforced. And what is more, CSR initiatives represent a fundamental best practice foundation on which future normative development could. But on the other side, it is necessary to remark that by observing the CSR discourse from the mere economic standpoint, the endorsement of standards for the protection of the environment, and more in general, the compliance with social standards has traditionally been conceived in terms of exclusive profit maximization. So a socially and environmentally responsible company may not genuinely decide to respect the values at the basis of their respective codes of conduct, but conversely to engage in CSR initiatives with a view to attract both investors and consumers to obtain economic advantages. So in fact, the increasing attention of consumers to the respect of the environment, human rights, and social standards easily evolves into an instrument of competitive struggles for MNEs, which tend to exploit greater consumer awareness. Therefore, to sum up, to conclude my intervention, I would resume by saying that overall, the proliferation of codes of conduct for the self-regulation of firms' behavior reflects the rejection of any hard law initiatives on the part of the business community. And at the same time, at present, such voluntary initiatives appear to be the most effective way of responding to normative gaps and loose social and environmental standards in host states, where most of the activities of global corporations are outsourced. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any question, I am more than glad to try to answer.
Thank you, Valentina. It was really an interesting point of view and a description of the status of the current situation, let's say, involving multinational companies. We have a couple of questions there within the audience, but I'd like to start first with a comment of mine, and then I'll take it from there and answer to our guests. Of course, it's very impressive. We know that multinational companies have GDPs, many multinational companies that are quite higher than countries, basically. So now we are aware that also technological innovation is mainly outsourced to a lot of multinational companies. So of course, there are some public institutions around the world that does research and development, but a lot of R&D is within the multinational companies. Is it possible to outsource also sustainability? And my question is, to be a little bit more extended, do you think that an aware market could force and could be enough for multinationals to actually turn sustainable, not to do greenwashing, but to actually turn sustainable, or regulation is required? And eventually give us some examples of that.
Okay, of course. So thank you for your comments and for your questions. I start from the last question. In my opinion, the market is fundamental because, as I was presenting during my speech, companies also started to adopt this kind of more sustainable ways of producing and of making business more in general, also thanks to consumers, which are more aware of the environmental considerations, but also social and labor standards, which are really important, for instance, in fashion. And in my opinion, this is not enough, of course, because, as I was saying, this led the companies to consider merely the economic part of the corporate social responsibility discourse, meaning that more consumers, which are more aware and ask the company to be more sustainable, can be also something that increases the general revenues of the multinational companies. And so this is my opinion. This is not enough because we need regulation, and this is another huge problem from the legal point of view because of multinational corporation structures, which are really difficult to grasp because they are incorporated, they are created under the domestic law of a country, which is the host state normally. But then the action are and the general operations are conducted usually in host states, which are less developed countries, generally countries in which environmental considerations and legislation are poor, loose, or mainly not enforced because of the governments, for instance, which are corrupted, but also countries in which labor standards are really low. An example can be the scandal of Rana Plaza. Mainly, this is the most famous one, which is related to the industry of fashion and is related to Bangladesh. So this is why regulation is needed, because we have to force corporations from above to adopt these standards, not just for economic benefits, but because it is right, it is correct to do for society and for the new values that are emerging and that are endorsed by civil society in general.
And I would say that the other two questions that we have here actually perfectly match to your answer, and I'm gonna actually combine them up because Mr. Abbas is asking, how do we hold corporations responsible for not fulfilling their CSR obligation? Point is, are there any CSR obligation? We don't know yet. And indeed, Lucia follows up with, since there is no binding framework for multinational companies and code of conduct are non-binding, what solutions do you propose to make companies adopt sustainable solutions?
Okay.
And how can they basically respect the environment?
Okay, these questions are really matching. I can answer to them together. So how do we hold corporations responsible for not fulfilling their CSR obligations? So corporate social responsibility is non-binding. It is something that comes from the enterprises itself and also from above in the case of intergovernmental standards of corporate social responsibility, but this is not binding. So we cannot hold corporations responsible per se, because there is not a law which says multinational companies have to respect social rights and environmental protection and something like this. There is just one consideration to make. This is why multinational companies are not considered subjects of international law. So there is not an international binding framework which is directly applicable on multinational companies. And this is mainly because they are not considered subjects. There is a very long discussion about this, whether we can hold companies accountable because they are subjects. They have some rights in international law. For instance, they can take part in arbitration, and this is why part of the doctrine considers that there is a developing issue with respect to corporate personality at international level. But at the moment, the general rule is that corporations are just participants, they are objects. There are some laws, for instance, human rights obligation, they are just imposed upon states. And the state has positive obligations to, let's say, let these norms be respected by the subjects that are under the sovereignty of states. It's quite complicated to explain, but it's also quite complicated in the legal doctrine itself. So,
go, please. I thought you were.
So, what can we do to answer to Lucia? There is another trend in the international legal discussion at the moment. It's really new, let's say, which is called contractualization of environmental protection. This is to say, we can use the oldest instrument, which is the contract, to make some obligations related to human rights and to environmental protection binding upon corporations, and we can do it by incorporating some obligations to respect the environment, but also some environmental principle and corporate social responsibility initiatives within a contract, so that this contractual clause makes this respect for environmental protection binding, but just upon the parties. Of course, there are a lot of problems of this because normally contracts are not disclosed, and it is really hard that a party invokes the cessation of the contract because of not respecting the obligations linked to environmental protection. But there is also something that is developing at international level, and we have a case which is mainly related to the law of the sea and concerns the contracts concluded with the International Seabed Authority, which is established by the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. And these contracts have to be concluded with the International Seabed Authority for the extraction of natural resources in the high seas. And within the contracts, there are some clauses which bind the parties, which are also multinational corporations and states, to respect some principles. For instance, the precautionary principle, the environmental impact assessment, which are customary international law. So this is an evolution. It's really hard, but some steps are on the way.
Lovely point of view, and I'd like to conclude this live. We went a little bit long, but it was worth it. We have 1 minute left, let's say. I'd like to take it from there and actually conclude saying that this contract approach is actually a market approach, of course, not B2C, but B2B, of course, within the parties. Eventually, if there are regulations on one side, for instance, making binding to respect some boundaries within the supply chain, that could be one way of imposing and forcing some multinational companies to have this kind of contracts with suppliers. That sometimes, it's I remember also a scandal with IKEA where they were promoting sustainability. They actually are usually, they're quite good in that, but they didn't realize that the one supplier of food and materials was actually doing very unsustainable practices, and they had to say, okay, we didn't know, but it's not our fault because We have many suppliers around the world. We cannot do the actual due diligence with all of them. Okay, but if they have to put this in a contract, eventually they might have to do this kind of due diligence, even though it could be an extra cost. But yeah, this could be a market approach that is quite interesting, going on the B2B side rather than to the B2C awareness and request. Thank you very much, Valentina. One more thing to our audience. Someone asked if there is a deck we can look at. If Valentina allows us, we are going to take abstracts from her speech and make out some slides and post them here in this same post.
Yes, of course. If you want, you can write to me if you have any doubt or clarification. And if you follow me, you can find all my articles in which I speak about this. And also, it is publicly available my master thesis in which I deeply explore this topic.
So, Valentina, if you may, if you wish, you can put all these links here on the post, on the comments. So we encourage people to follow you and to read you. Thank you very much. I would say that we will see each other with Ethics for Growth and our lives next month with many surprises, other great experts. And don't forget to redeem your tree. As usual, our 2022 partnership with Freedom. Valentina, have you redeemed your tree or not yet?
Yes, of course.
Great. So be part of the Freedom Forest, the E4G Freedom Forest. Plant a tree with us. Thank you very much. See you next month, and keep following us and keep following Valentina, or start following Valentina if you don't yet. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.